It is the final hours of the G7 summit in Evian, France, and so far, while it's been a meeting of world leaders without major breakthroughs, it's also been one without too many diplomatic headaches either. Donald Trump, forever the wild card at summits like this, acknowledged Ukraine's improved fortunes on the battlefield and signed a unified pledge to impose new sanctions on Russia. Trump then did have some diplomatic momentum when he arrived at the G7 earlier on this week, having secured the framework of a deal with Iran. The agreement is thin on detail, but the other leaders at the G7 have nonetheless thrown their weight behind the US president's initiative, this in a bid to end the conflict and open the Strait of Hormuz. Well, Trump, though, in a meeting this afternoon with the Egyptian president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, also at the G7, warned that bombing Iran still remains an option.
No, it's not final. It's a memorandum of understanding. And if I don't like it, we'll go back to shooting at them, dropping bombs on their head. If I don't like it, if they don't behave, we'll go right back to dropping bombs right smack in the middle of their head. Okay? Because they've misbehaved for 47 years.
Well, Donald Trump not mincing his words there, and we may well get more from him on Iran later on this afternoon, because we are expecting a press conference from the US leader as well as from Emmanuel Macron, the French president. We'll bring you both of those live when they get underway. Before they do, though, let's speak to Philip Turle, France 24's reporter who is at Evian for this summit. Philip, you've obviously been there since the beginning, following the diplomatic negotiations very closely. What's your sense as to overall how this summit has gone?
Well, I think I'll echo the spokesperson for Emmanuel Macron, who was saying that this has been a very successful G7 summit, certainly from a French point of view. He's been saying it's the most successful summit since 2017. So I think there is definitely a feeling on the French side that one of the major victories is keeping Donald Trump on board. It's well known that Donald Trump doesn't like these multinational affairs, multilateral affairs. He prefers one-on-one democracy, one-on-one talks with world leaders in order to better dominate them. And he awfully walked out of the G7 summit this time last year in Canada, so he's stayed the course. So that is certainly, I think, being seen as a major victory for the French. And the second one, of course, is the fact that the French are pleased that Donald Trump appears to have changed his posture concerning the war in Ukraine, steering more away from Russia and throwing his weight apparently more behind Ukraine now. I think it's been touted to him that Ukraine may have turned the tides on the Russians, and it's now time to back a new winner in this war, not back the loser being Vladimir Putin. That's why Donald Trump has changed his mind, but there are reports also of a deal that has been worked out between the G7 members and Donald Trump, and that's to say, well, look, we will back your agreement with Iran to end the war there, but we will only do that if you will change your posture as far as Ukraine is concerned and throw your weight behind the Ukrainians. And it seems to have worked that Donald Trump is more open to throwing his weight behind the Ukrainians in exchange for support from certainly other Gulf members who've been at this meeting yesterday, notably Qatar and the United Arab Emirates and Egypt, that they will support the deal that Donald Trump has reportedly signed with Iran. We're going to get more details on that at the signing ceremony, hopefully on Friday in Geneva. But in exchange for that, Donald Trump appears to have shifted somewhat his position concerning Vladimir Putin.
OK, so as you say, Philip, then the big geopolitical talking points at this summit have really been Iran and Ukraine. But let's not forget artificial intelligence, because the leaders have been talking plenty about that too.
That's true. That was one of the major topics on the agenda today, and a word of warning from G7 members that they now see that there is a risk of them becoming dependent on the major powers, notably China and the United States, for artificial intelligence, and that is not something that they think is a good idea. The reason being that Donald Trump, ahead of these talks, decided that Anthropic, one of the two main AI organizations in the US, would not be able to let foreigners join up and to profit from their artificial intelligence, which means that other countries would have to fill that gap. And I think that is certainly something that the countries here are keen to try to overcome, but also saying that artificial intelligence is one of the great challenges of the future, and we've got to take that on board as much as we did the internet, for example, some 20 or 25 years ago. And there is another issue which has been on the debating table today as well, which is important, and that is protection of minors when it comes to social media and the internet. All the countries, all 7 members of the G7, including the United States, have agreed that youth from the age of 15 or 16 below those ages should not be allowed onto social media. The UK has already taken the necessary steps to introduce a ban on that. France has indicated that it could be willing to also introduce a ban on young people having access to social media below the age of 16.
All right, Philip, for the moment, thank you so much. Philip Tell for us there at the G7. Well, as I say, we are waiting for President Emmanuel Macron to give the first big press conference at the end of this G7. And while we wait for him to speak, let's get some analysis for you on the programme. Manuel Muñiz is with me. He's a professor of international relations based in Madrid. Hello, and thanks for speaking to us here on France 24.
Hello, a real pleasure.
Look, just before we talk, let's take a listen to what it is that Donald Trump had to say this morning when he walked into the room with the other G7 leaders.
Well, hello. I'm the boss.
Well, look, a really short soundbite there, but you may have heard Donald Trump saying as he went in to greet Emmanuel Macron, Keir Starmer, Friedrich Merz and the rest of them, "I am the boss," this after arriving late to the room. Classic Trump, isn't it? I wonder what you make of that and how it is that he and the other leaders appear to have got on during the last few days.
No, it seems that they've gotten on quite well. I mean, that's a very classic Trump statement. You were saying in the reporting before that he doesn't really like these multilateral forums, that he much rather engage in these bilateral diplomatic engagements with countries. I think he feels he has greater leverage. Definitely, he's much more of a protagonist in those formats, bilateral formats, than in these. And I think that that's what underlies that sort of joke and comment of his. But there is some substance to the fact of the format that he prefers. But I think the G7 overall has been quite a successful meeting, despite the fact that really most of the substantive issues on the agenda were either decided outside of the bounds of the G7, or were in the process of being negotiated in different formats, be it the engagement with the Iranians through the Pakistanis and the Qataris, or other forums, or the dialogue with the Russians and the Ukrainians. So the G7 itself built a space for exchanges on these things. But in fact, it wasn't on the substantive side the place where many of these things were effectively being decided.
OK, so perhaps more sort of style over substance at this G7, given that, as you say, a lot of the details are being discussed elsewhere. Let's talk, though, about Iran. We know that European countries have been pretty sidelined in the talks that have been taking place between the US and Iran, mediated by Pakistan. Is it your sense from the comments coming out of this G7 that on that issue, at least, the Europeans do have Donald Trump's ear?
Well, I mean, it depends on how you read it. My sense, though, is that the agreement that has been reached, that MOU, that preliminary agreement that, in fact, President Trump was referring also in your clip before this, is what really lays out the roadmap for a more permanent peace. I don't think Europeans, let alone G7 countries in this format, were actively involved in the negotiation of that agreement or in its implementation. When you look at the actual substance and content, both on sanctions relief, on issues regarding the Strait of Hormuz, on the nuclear program, and on others, it's probably going to be other formats and other actors be more directly involved. So my sense is that really the substance happened right before the G7. And I think in general in Europe, we've been very reluctant to engage in that conflict, given the fact that we were not proactively consulted on both the conduct of the operations or the calendar, the specific moment of start. And I think that has just led to a lot of reluctance on then being dragged into the management of its consequences, particularly the Strait of Hormuz blockade, which has then led to all of the issues in energy markets, agricultural markets, and many others.
And look, we don't have the details of the memorandum of understanding between the US and Iran officially yet, but according to the leaks, the Strait could well reopen as early as this Friday once the deal is signed. If that is true, what role do you think European countries will play then in trying to keep it open? Because it seems that is something that these G7 leaders have been talking about.
My sense is that the fundamental actors in keeping the Strait open once the agreement comes into force will be fundamentally the Iranians and then the Gulf countries, the Omanis and others, in making sure that the Strait functions properly and that there is traffic in and out. I do not foresee the need of any permanent deployment of any kind in guaranteeing this. And if that is necessary, then the opening has not been truly successful, right? Even the American commitment, it seems to be to withdraw forces, naval forces and others from the area to allow then the Strait to function normally. The Iranians have, of course, been extraordinarily effective in leveraging this very asymmetric strength of theirs in their capacity to close the Strait. And there seem to be, according to some leaks and preliminary analysis of this MOU, real concessions being made in order for the Strait to be open. Some of these concessions seem to involve the transfer of significant amounts of funding to the Iranian government and the lifting of sanctions, which would also have an economic effect. And this, it could be understood as a transaction in exchange for the opening of the Strait. It's not a tolling mechanism, which would have been, I think, extraordinarily painful and a very negative precedent. Tolling mechanism over an open Strait that had been open for a very, very long time before this conflict. But there does seem to be some form of economic transaction. And that will happen irrespective of European involvement in the actual management of the Strait. So my sense is that if things play out as we all hope they will, you will see a reopening of the Strait and there won't be any need of active management of the Strait. That would be ideal.
Yeah, just a last question for you on the optics of this G7 as we look at some of those pictures of the of the G7 leaders, among them a good number of Europeans. It seems to me that Emmanuel Macron, the host, set the bar for success at this G7 very low indeed. It seems to me that the bar was, let's keep the US president happy enough, let's have him stay until the end of the summit, remembering that he left the last G7 in Canada early. What does it say about European American relations that we're calling this a success, even though we don't have an official long communique, but separate documents on individual issues, and as you were saying earlier on, nothing tangible has actually been agreed at this G7?
No, but I mean, one has to take into account the context of this G7, and it's a very challenging context in the transatlantic relationship. I mean, you would be hard-pressed to find a moment in the last decades where there were so many disagreements on the table across the Atlantic. So from the management of trade and the future of the WTO and the tariff war, to the management of climate, to security issues about the future of NATO and burden sharing on the security agenda, to the management of the Ukraine war and the relationship with Russia. It's such a long list. I mean, in the past, Europeans and Americans have disagreed on fundamental elements of policy. I remember the Iraq war that really split the transatlantic alliance and many other, Suez and many others. No, but it's hard to find a moment where there are so many. So I think it is a success to manage to build a G7 within the bounds of an agenda that actually allows for some form of consensus between the Americans and the Europeans, plus the Canadians. It's also very telling, by the way, just a final line, because I think that this is really an insight from this G7, that the central topics of discussion have basically been fundamentally global economic management. So this is economic diplomacy, tech, which I think basically indicates the rise of technology to a geopolitical category of its own in its own right, and I think this is very relevant and will continue to happen. And then the involvement of global South countries, which is really, it's telling us where the future of the global economy and global power is located. A lot of it is being displaced towards the east, towards the Indias of the world, the Brazils and other countries that have been present in this meeting. So more than the substance, I would argue it's a success because it's kept the transatlantic alliance in place. And it's a success because it has brought to the agenda in its format and substance the new topics that will dominate global governance moving forward.
Manuel Muñiz talking to us there. Thank you so much for your analysis today, sir. It's been good to speak to you.
Thank you.